This video covers the core fundamental skills of Substance Painter to get you texturing as quick as possible. The first step is to create a new Substance Painter project. Head up to the top left and go File, New. This will open up a little window where we can first choose a template, use as ASM PBR metallic roughness. Then we're going to select a file. This is going to be any model that you've created exported. Make sure it is UV unwrapped. Lastly, this document resolution, we can change it later, but I usually like to start at 2048. You should now see your 3D object on the scene. By default, it's split into these two screens where you've got your 3D object on the left and your UVs on the right. We can change this though by heading up to the top right corner. Look for the icon fourth from the right. This is where you change from 3D, 2D to either 3D only or 2D only. Most of the time I work from 3D only. Next up, let's have a quick look around the UI. On the far left, we've got a bunch of tools. We'll have a look at the most useful ones later in the video. Right next to that, we have this shelf, which holds essentially all the texturing assets that you might need to use for your texturing process. At the top of your screen, you'll have a little hotbar here that's got a bunch of options for the tool that you're using. Over to the right, we've got this texture set list. This is going to show all texture sets and materials that are in the project. As you can see here, in a project with multiple texture sets, we can turn each one on and off and even isolate them. Notice how each one will have a different set of layers. This means that we have to texture them separately. Speaking of layers, they're just underneath this, as well as texture set settings, which we'll have a bit more of a look at in a second. Below that is properties. This is an extended version of what we saw at the top. It's got properties of whatever layer or tool we're using. Next up, very important step, how to move the camera. If you hold Alt, you will actually see the shortcuts down the bottom left. They're exactly like Maya if you've used that before. What they are is holding Alt and left mouse is going to let you rotate. Holding Alt and clicking in your scroll wheel, your middle mouse, that's going to let you pan. And holding Alt and right mouse will zoom. Alternatively, you can just use your scroll wheel to zoom as well. Just before we start texturing, we want to bake our mesh maps. Head to texture set settings here, scroll down and look for this button that says bake mesh maps. This will open up a little pop-up window. In this one, all we want to do is change the output size to something a little bit higher and then go bake selected textures just to keep things simple. You can do this with a high poly mesh, but in this example, we're just using this same mesh to bake the maps. What we'll get is a bunch of these maps like ambient occlusion and curvature that are going to help Substance Painter do some automatic texturing for us and save us some time. Let's switch back to layers here and see how we can start to texture our object. 90% of the time we're going to use fill layers when texturing. That's this little paint bucket icon right here. If we create one of these, we can see how it works. Essentially what it is it's going to fill in the whole object with one color or one material. We can name this by double clicking on it. It's always good to stay organized when working with a layer. Next up, we can move down to the properties section here and we can see what options we have to customize our fill layer. First up, we can realize that each fill layer is made out of a color, height, rough, metal, and normal map. We can change the color here by clicking on this gray rectangle. It will open up a little color picker where we can select the desired color. We'll ignore height for now as it won't do much as a full layer. We'll have a look at it later. The other ones to really look at here are roughness, which is going to control how either shiny or matte the material is. The lower the roughness, the shinier it is, the higher it is, the more matte the material. And then we have metallic as well underneath that, which is essentially what it sounds like. If your surface is metallic, then we're going to have to increase this value and we'll get that signature metal look. If we want to make more complex textures here, all we really need to do is stack these fill layers on top of each other and then mask out certain areas until we get the desired result. I've just created a contrasting fill layer on top of our gray layer, and now let's explore all the options we have for masking it out on top. The first option we have is geometry mask, which you can find a little box to the right of your layer, and we can select that and we can start doing our geometry mask. In your properties section, you'll notice a list here of every single object that makes up your whole object. These are based on how they are in your 3D modeling program. So if you've combined objects, be aware they will show up as one object in the geometry mask. What we can do is we can turn them on and off with these little tick boxes, or alternatively, we can hold Control to take away from the selection, or we can hold Shift to add to the selection by clicking in the 3D view. You'll see if you switch back to the fill layer itself, you'll notice that we've masked our blue layer to only appear on some of the objects and not all of them. One nice technique here is to hold Control and deselect all our objects from our geometry mask. This way we can choose just a select few objects to show up for this fill layer. We can of course do the opposite by holding Shift instead and then selecting everything to bring it all back. Let's now look at black mask. These can create a lot higher detailed selections for our fill layers. We can add them by clicking on our layer, clicking on this little icon and selecting Add Black Mask. Our layer now splits up into two little boxes, one with our fill layer that we can change the settings to, and now this new one, a black mask, where we can make a selection. Head over to the left and we can choose one of our tools. Let's start with our paint. Essentially what it is just a paintbrush where we can paint white to bring forth the fill layer color. We'll have a look at custom brushes in a second. Next up, let's choose the fourth tool down on the left here, the Polygon fill. This is similar to the geometry mask, but we also have more options. We can choose the selection type here, as well as if we're painting with white or black. Remember, on the black mask, painting white brings forth the color, and painting black takes away from the selection. You can switch between white and black simply by pressing X. You can see these first two selection modes, triangle and quad, let us pretty much just select the faces on our model. Switching to this object one, it really becomes like the geometry mask. Unlike the geometry mask, it ignores if objects are combined. So it just essentially looks for objects separated in the 3D space. For all these selection modes, we can draw a box to make a selection. Just be aware that this passes through the mesh, so you'll select things on the other side as well. Our last selection mode here is UV chunk fill. This one's a little tricky, but as long as you understand how your UVs have been cut, it can be quite useful sometimes. I find personally the best use is for selecting ends of cylinders because they're usually a hard selection to create and it will select that circular shape quite easily, as you can see here. Geometry mask or polygon fill on black mask is always my go-to first step when texturing something like this, as it just lets you block out large areas of your model into different materials or fill layers, which you can refine later on. Before we move on to more complex selection, we should notice that we can actually add layers to the black mask. So down the bottom here, if you right click on the black mask, you can choose from add paint, or there's some other options there. Usually you're going to use paint at this stage. These work exactly how you'd expect. They are just layers. If there's one above it, it's going to overwrite the one below it. This example is something that I use all the time, where you're going to start with a polyfill selection on a layer. Then you're going to create another paint layer on top of that in the black mask. This will just let you refine it with the paintbrush and you still have control over each. So you've got the big selection as well as this detailed paint. Notice here that if we paint black on the details layer, that's overriding the polyfill below. It won't work the other way just because of how the layer stack works. Let's check out the custom brushes we have available. Find the brush section in the shelf over here and you'll see there's a whole bunch of different brushes we can choose from. All you have to do is left click on these, and if you're painting on your black mask, you're going to be painting in white, and you can see we can get all different kinds of effects. You can change the size, flow, opacity of your brush at the top, as well as you'll find more options down the bottom right in the properties as well. There's a few shortcuts for these. If you hold Control, you see them pop up in the bottom left, just like before. The most important one here being Control and right mouse, left and right will let you control the size of the brush. It's a really handy one. Even with all the automatic texturing that we'll go over soon, there's still no substitute for manual painting, so it is something you're going to still be doing a lot. A little important demo here, as it's something that happens quite a bit. If you're painting and you see that your brush strokes kind of bleed onto other objects, just remember that you're working in black and white. So if you switch to your polyfill and something like an object, you can easily deselect anything that you don't want. And that means you can keep your brush strokes where you want them. Speaking of automatic texturing, we can head over to the shelf again and check out the Smart Mask section. What these are a bunch of kind of presets that have been given to you that are going to use the mesh maps that we baked at the start of this to give us some automatic texturing. All you need to do is drag them across from the shelf and put them onto the black mask. This will use the information in those maps like ambient occlusion to essentially just do some automatic masking. So you can imagine if there's dirt buildup, it's going to look for that ambient occlusion, the gaps and the cracks in your model. Some of them might have edge detection for things like edge wear, or some of them will use the position map, which will have things like dirt buildup on the bottom or moss on top. You may notice that these work by creating something called a mask editor layer on the black mask. We're not going to go into them in this video, but feel free to explore that mask editor layer and you'll get a bit of an understanding on how they work and how you can customize them further. Lastly, let's look at alphas. What these essentially are is just a black and white image that is going to let us place any kind of shape onto our layer. And this is also how Substance Painter deals with text. These work exactly the same way as a custom brush. All we need to do is left click and select an alpha, and then we can paint it directly onto our black mask. Substance Painter remembers our previous brush settings. Make sure to check there's no weird jitter or rotation on the brush, as this will stop the alpha being placed correctly. As these work exactly like they would be a brush, all your settings for rotation and size are going to be exactly the same. Use this to your advantage and place your alphas exactly how you want them to appear on your object. Let's now have a look at our alternatives to our fill layers. The two first sections here in our shelf are materials and smart materials. Materials are just kind of base textures that we can use to get certain looks, while smart materials are similar to smart masks as they use your mesh maps that we baked at the start. As you can see, to add these to your layer stack, all you need to do is drag and drop them onto your 3D object, and it will make what is essentially a fill layer for that material. Some of these material layers will have custom properties down in the properties section that you can change to get different effects. As you can see, we can also change the scale and rotation to match the scale of our object here. Below that, this material has options to change the roughness and height and even the color of the material itself. It's worth mentioning you can find extra materials and smart materials on the Substance Painter website. There is a Substance Share, which is from the community assets. These are pretty good, but they are a little lower quality sometimes. Substance also has more of an official asset library. You can have access to this if you have an active license. I believe you can download 30 a month. You won't be able to access this if you're a student. I'll put the links to both these sites in the description. Let's now have a look at what smart materials are all about. These are a great base layer a lot of the time when you're texturing because they'll do some automatic texturing for you. A lot of these will have sort of like dirt or edgeware already built in. These work the same way as materials where we just drag and drop them onto the object and you'll see it's created a new layer. Most of these are actually folders made out of fill layers. As long as you baked your mesh maps at the start, you should notice the texture reacting to different parts of your model. Because these are usually made out of a selection of fill layers, they're heavily customizable. Let's have a look at how this one's made. You can see this smart material is made out of 4 different layers. We can turn them all on and off to see how they're built. The base layer is just a fill layer with a metallic value to give it that sort of shine. On top of that, there's a paint layer, and you can see on the mask that it's built with a mask editor, just like our smart mask from before. This gives this one the edgeware, as well as these little paint chips you see all over the object. Above that, we have Rust, which again is a mask editor that kind of just covers most of the model with this sort of dirty looking rust, especially in the corners. So that's definitely using our ambient occlusion map. Finally, there's just a layer on top that has a filter, and it's a sharpen filter. You can check out filters yourself. I'm not going to go into them in this tutorial. Now that we know how these smart materials are built, we can easily go into them and customize them. The first way, of course, is to click on the fill layer themselves, where we can change the base color, the roughness, and the metal value if we want to. You can see here how quickly and easily I've just changed the color of the paint and the underlying metal to get a different look from the original smart material. The next way is to actually alter the black mask on some of these layers. We can have a look at the rust one here. We could mess around with the mask editor, but what I recommend is adding a paint layer on top of the mask editor. And this way we can add or take away from the existing mask and make the look completely different. Remember, there is no substitute to manual painting, so this is where we can really start to make our texture unique. Texturing is a storytelling device, so make sure you're having a think about what story you're trying to tell on your model. In this example, this spaceship engine might be sitting in the dump, and there's a lot more dirt built up on the bottom as opposed to the top. So I can manually take some away from the top and then add a lot more to the bottom. Next, let's revisit that core idea of stacking fill layers on top of each other. Of course, this is where we have the option to either add a material, smart material, or just a basic fill layer. Let's add a new smart material just to see that we can easily add that on top, then mask out a few areas to have just this new one. Even with just 2 smart materials stacked here, you can really start to see how quick and easy this texturing process really can be. Following our core idea again, we can easily add a paint layer to this black mask and further refine our initial polygon fill selection and add some of that manual painting. This process can just be continued as much as you need, adding all fill layers, materials and smart materials until you're happy. Let's move on to some other cool things we can add to our texture, starting with painted height. To do this, we're going to create a fill layer and then go down to properties and deselect all material maps except for height. You can do this by clicking them off or alt-clicking on height. Then we can decrease the value or increase the value. We can always change it later. We won't actually see a difference until we mask out some of the fill layer. So let's do that. Add a black mask to the height layer. Now that it's a black mask, it follows the same rules as everything else we've covered. We can use our paintbrush, we can use our alphas, or we can even use polyfill if we wanted to. Adding to the mask should now be painting height. This is a great way to add depth to your texture and object without needing to have modeled it in the first place. Another cool tip here that works anytime we're using our brush, not just for height, is holding shift when we draw our lines. If you click at a start, hold shift, you should see a dotted line and you'll be able to draw some straight lines. If you hold shift and control, the line should snap to 15-degree increments. You also may have seen me move the light around. If you hold shift and right mouse, you can shift the direction of the light. Lastly, as mentioned, we can use alphas for this as well. It's a great way to add some cool details all over your mesh. You can also find a lot of great height-specific alphas online, especially for hard surface texturing. These are pretty invaluable to speeding up your workflow. We'll talk about adding custom assets in just a second. As we use the fill layer for this height, we can see if we head back to the layer itself, we can adjust the height level, and that means we can actually make this an extrusion or an indent depending on the look we want. It's also worth mentioning that these layers don't have to be solely height. We can add color, roughness, and metal to make some sort of combination layer to get some unique looks. Let's now see how we can import some custom assets, starting with alphas. You'll need to make your alphas in something like Photoshop, making sure that you have a square canvas with a black background and your alpha is white. Export this out as a PNG or a JPEG, and then simply just drag and drop the alpha into the shelf on the left in Substance Painter. This will open up a little pop-up window where we have a few things to look at. First thing we need to do is click on Undefined and tell Substance it's an alpha. Then we're going to head down to this Import Resources to, where you have a few options. Current session will take it out of your shelf once you close Substance. Project will keep it in there every time you open this project, and Library will keep it in Substance Painter no matter which project you're working on. So choose one that suits the assets best. Your alpha should now be imported to your shelf where you can use it exactly like we've used it before. So using with a brush on a black mask, and you can bring forth whatever is on the fill layer in the shape of the alpha. Even if you're using text, remember this is just an alpha, so we can easily just customize it with a brush as well. You can help blend these kind of alphas into your texture. Next, let's have a look at how we can add an image to our texture. This is handled in a unique way as an image already has its colors, so we can't use a fill layer for this. It's best if the image is square and it can read transparency, so you can save these as PNGs. Import is similar to our alpha. We're going to drag and drop our image into the shelf here, and in the little pop-up, instead of alpha, we're going to choose texture this time. And of course, choose your best suited bottom option as well. Our custom image should now be in the shelf, and the way we're going to actually place it on our object is to drag and drop it directly onto the place we would like to put it. We'll get a little option box, and we're going to choose base color here. This will actually create a paint layer for us, and it will place the object on it with this little projection gizmo. This gizmo has a couple options. We can definitely just move it around the mesh like this, but there's also a few transform tools located at the top of your screen. These will help you rotate, scale, and even warp the image to get a desired placement. If you would like to refine this further, instead of using a black mask here, try out a white mask. This will just let us take a little bit away and get a good result. The last thing I'd like to cover here is adding opacity and emission to our texture. We first need to add these channels. Let's start with emission. Head to the texture set settings and look for this channels section and this plus sign and select emissive. Nothing will be visibly different at this point, but what it will do is give us an extra channel when we look at our layers. So if you open up a fill layer here, you should now see this emiss channel option. This works similar to base color. We can just choose a nice bright color here and it's going to give us this glow effect. This of course works just like any other fill layer. We can now add a black mask and then select which areas we would like this emissive color to be on. Next up, let's add some opacity so we can add things like glass onto our texture. You may notice in your channels, opacity doesn't exist. We'll need to select this shader settings icon on the right and change the shader we're using at the top here. We're looking for this one here, PBR Metal Rough with Alpha Blending. Switch to that. If we head back to our channel list in the texture set settings and click the plus icon again, we can now see opacities there and we can add it just like we did emissive. This will of course now add another little channel option onto our fill layers. We can see here it's called OP. That's our opacity. This is just a slider. The lower we go, the more transparent the fill layer will become. You can use this in conjunction with your roughness and metallic sliders and even color to get some nice looking glass effects or whatever sort of opacity you need for your texture. This concludes what I personally believe you need to know to begin texturing in Substance Painter. There's of course a lot more that Substance Painter can do, some more advanced techniques. If you're curious and would like to extend your learning, I can't recommend enough the official Substance Painter YouTube channel. Wes does some incredible tutorials on there and you'll learn everything that you ever need to know. I'll link to the channel in the description. To finish off the video, let's have a look at a finalized result using all the techniques covered in this video. We'll also go over exporting your textures out so you can use them in other software. With a little bit of time, effort, and video magic, of course, we can see that using the techniques in this video, we can still create really incredible looking textures with just the basic fundamentals of what Substance Painter has to offer. Before we break down the layers to create a texture like this, let's quickly go over exporting your textures on a finished model. Before we export, we may want to upscale our textures from the 2K that we started with up to 4K textures. This will just give everything a higher resolution. Head to your texture set settings and look for this size and just click 4096. This will upscale all your brush strokes so it won't stretch any of your textures or anything like that. It will give you a really high quality result. To export these textures now, head up to the top left, File, and look for Export Textures. This will open up a little window. The main thing we have to do here is choose a nice output directory. Select that folder, make sure the other settings make sense to you, file type, and then export. You'll know when it's done as it will tell you in the little console on the right. This will have exported your textures out into nice 4K images that you can now import into whatever software you would like to use them for. Alright, to finish off, let's have a little look at this example here and we'll break down just each layer really quick just so you can get an idea of what a finished result looks like using everything that we learned. So we'll start from the top. First thing at the top here is I've got an emission layer. I've actually built this out of a bunch of different layers, and that's just to get me some different sort of colors for the emission. So I've kind of gradiented them on top of each other to create this kind of glow in the middle of the engine. We can see here the different layers as we go up. Underneath that, I've just got a fuel meter layer. And the reason this one is actually just one layer is because I've used a paint layer here. So this is a good example of where a paint layer might be useful, right? It's only a small area and there's a good chance I don't need too much control on changing the layer later. And if I do, I could probably redo it because it's not a huge effort there. And the benefit of a paint layer, right, is that I have the option to change my color really quickly. So I've got multiple colors here and I've just painted them one at a time with a little stripe inside of a black mask on a folder here, which means that I could paint inside there really easily. Underneath that, we've got our height layer. So we can see that one here. And that's just what we talked about before, right? We've got a layer here. It has a height of a little bit less than 0. And then it's also got a little bit of a base color on here. And that means I can just get some sort of darker areas and it's a bit more noticeable. So that's where I've added all these details over the whole sort of model here, just to create some depth in the texture. We've then got this custom texture logo. So that's my little channel icon here that I've just placed on the side. And then of course, I've just masked it out. One thing I did here is I used a white mask instead of a black mask, and that's just because it's easier to take away from that, right? Because a white mask just has everything in, then we can paint a little bit of black on top there. Next up, we've got our rust, which is just on the metal areas I've only placed it on, and you can see I actually have a geometry mask on that one, right? So that means I've just quickly masked it out so it only affects where I've placed my metal texture, and that's where the rust goes. There's a dirt underneath that, which kind of goes over the whole thing. You can see it's fairly subtle, but it just adds that sort of depth, and it really sort of highlights where there's areas of ambient occlusion especially. Next one down, we've got rubber dry, which is a smart material. And all I've done with that is then again masked it into the areas I wanted to. So a lot of my wires, I've just covered them. And you can see when I turn that on and off, the wires look a lot different, right? Underneath them, I've just colored them one color each. But here, I've covered them with rubber, and then I've got sort of like a wear where, some parts of it have gone away, and you get this really cool effect. I've also make sure to add some height to the overall rubber layer, and that means I kind of get this depth where it looks like it's kind of worn away, chipped away, like rubber does, when it wears down. Next up, we've got our wires layer. This is again a folder. This time I have made them into separate layers, so I didn't use a paint layer here. And that just means, I could come into these layers if I wanted to at any point, and I could change the color to something else. You can see here that changes it to blue. So we can use them how I would like to. I've masked them out just to these separate sections where I wanted to use them. Next up, we've got paint details, and that's this little folder here that contains all three of my paint layers essentially, right? So I have my cyan paint, which is these little details, these little alphas I placed around the texture. And then I've got this black paint here, which is over these larger areas, and this one at the front. And then of course the white paint here on the front. So if I turn these all off, you can kind of see that they're separated out. You can set these up in a nice way. You can see in this one in my black mask, I've got one for weathering. So that means I can turn that on and off, and you can see that it only controls the weathering here. So it gives me that option to change that later. I've got my text, which just refers to that one alpha that I've used. So if I wanted to change that kind of stuff, I also use it on this little icon down here. And then the main sort of stripes there. So having these on separate layers inside the layer just gives me more options and more control if I need to change this stuff later on. We've got these bottom two layers, which are our final ones. And essentially all these are slightly customized smart materials. So these are just straight out of the box over here. And I've gone in, I think I brightened up the steel base a little bit, and we've sort of added a layer on top. You can see here, steel base copy. So I just did it for this front section here, and you can kind of see these parts of the inside of the engine, they're a little bit lighter. It just gives a bit of contrast in there, which is going to look a little bit nicer. And you can see if I turn that off, the main layer on the bottom is just that base orange paint. I actually copied the layer inside the paint layer a few times, and that's just so I could kind of layer and add a bit of a gradient. Really, really subtle, might be hard to see in the video. But if we see this top layer here, it's got a bit of a gradient on it, and that just helps sort of tell me where the bottom and the top is, and it reads a lot better as a texture. But for the most part, it's just a slightly customized smart material. And that's essentially it. I will make this a download, a Substance Painter project file for you to have a look at if you would like to. I'll put that in the description. You can download it and you can see for yourself how this was built. But it is pretty simple, and we've only used the things covered in this video. I hope you learned something over this video, and it's a great resource to come back, especially using the chapters just to remember little parts that you may have forgotten.